Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming for Hershey Dwoskin. Today is Tuesday, November 18th. I'm forgetting my dates. So I have a few program announcements. So December 1st, Monday, December 1st, we'll have Dr. Joe Schwartz, and the topic is concern for food additives. On the 7th of December, we have children's, it's more like for family, but we're telling you guys, so if you're interested, we'll have Grammy Award nominee winner, Jennifer Gasoy, and the tickets are $5. It's a holiday concert. So please bring your grandchildren and yourselves and enjoy the show. So here's Hershey Dwoskin. Thank you.
Thank you, Angela. Hi, everybody. Thank you all so much for coming out. This is my last class for the year here. I'm one of the reduced number of people who are going to Florida this year. As you all know, there's been quite a holdback of Canadians going down south. But, you know, for my own personal reasons, we have a place there. And if I don't go there, so it's just going to sit there. So, you know, it's a decision that we made. I have to say, thinking about it, but not automatically, but thinking about it. So let me, I have a few different things to speak about today, but I'd like to speak about this week's events. There's really three kind of important and special events that have happened this week. And I have to start with this vote in the United Nations Security Council. This is really a special event because the United Nations Security Council, by a vote of 13-0, with 2 abstentions, rubber stamped President Trump's Gaza plan. So why is this so significant? I mean, he came up with this plan. It didn't have to go to the United Nations. He could have said, well, let's do it anyway. But what this plan involves is a multinational team to help reconstruct Gaza, both reconstruct it physically and reconstruct it politically and reconstruct it historically. And without this United Nations stamp of approval, countries from around the world who are supposed to participate in this, some countries supplying peacekeeping forces, some countries supplying money. Without this UN approval, these countries would be in a tough political situation if they said, okay, we're going to listen to President Trump and do what he says. This way, they can say, we're listening to the United Nations. We're part of a whole United Nations approved team to rebuild Gaza. So that's why it's really such a significant vote. Let me ask you a question. When was the last time that the United Nations approved a multinational peacekeeping force to go into a country to start to rebuild it? Anybody have some ideas about that? Where? Korea? Wow, pretty good. Yes, that was the right answer. In Kosovo specifically, but Bosnia also. They're two separate things, but both pretty closely related to each other. So to this day, there is an international supervisory force in Kosovo and one in Bosnia. What happens when these forces come in is that these situations become frozen. So the minus is that the pluses are that there's a peacekeeping force and the peace is kept, so there's no civil conflict. And there is some element of stability that goes along with that, so the countries can develop. The minus is that if you took out these forces, whatever caused the war or to start with in the first place could come back again. Another important one goes way back to our times, way back when, is in Cyprus. There is still a UN peacekeeping force in Cyprus. There's a UN peacekeeping force in Lebanon on the border with Israel to watch over the Hezbollahs. So the UN has made these kind of decisions many times in the past to try to be somewhat of an impartial referee on the one hand, but more importantly, to keep warring sides apart from each other so that development can happen. So that's why this is such an important decision that the UN made. So I said it was 13-0 with 2 abstentions. The 2 abstentions were Russia and China, 2 important countries, obviously. Why did Russia and China disapprove? Or we'll say, why did they abstain? Well, they say it's because there wasn't enough emphasis put on the creation of a Palestinian state. It's nice to say that, but the real reason is because they just didn't want to give Trump any kind of reward for what he was doing. So that's that vote. So what is this peacekeeping force supposed to consist of? It's supposed to consist of soldiers from other Muslim countries around the world who volunteered to go to Gaza once things get settled to keep the peace, to make sure that they're supposed to make sure that Hamas is disarmed. This is a point of contention because Hamas now says they never agreed to disarm, but clearly they must have agreed at one point or other because that's how this whole deal came about. And they're also there to really prevent Israel from going back into Gaza and you know, causing more damage and more harm than they already have done. So that's their job. Now, the money part is supposed to come from rich Arab countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE to literally rebuild Gaza. I mean, remember, it's a tiny little place with more than 2 million people where somewhere between 75 and 80-ish% of the buildings have been destroyed. So people are living literally in tents. It's now the rainy season starting, and you know, they don't have any other places to live. So this type of construction has to go about get done quickly. So in a certain sense, 2 parties disagreed with the totality of the plan. So the totality of the plan, as you might remember, there were 20 different elements in it. The very first element was that the hostages have to be released. The second element was that all of the dead Israeli hostages have to be returned, and only 3 remain to be returned. One of whom was a Thai worker, and the other 2 were Israelis. Maybe those casualties will never be returned because they could be buried somewhere. We don't know. The third element was that prisoners have to be released from Israeli jails and brought back to either the West Bank or Gaza, or be allowed to leave the area altogether and go abroad. And Israel did do that. They released somewhere over 1,500 prisoners in exchange for the 20 live hostages that were released. The ratio was very high. I mean, not 1,000 to 1 as it had been, you know, in a previous release, but it was somewhere around 15 to 1. So, but I do think the number that they released was over 1,000 in the end. So that's those 3 elements. The other elements were that Israel is supposed to withdraw gradually in stages from Gaza. They already withdrew from half of Gaza, so that's the first stage that's done. The other agreement was that foreign aid or humanitarian aid is allowed to come into Gaza to meet the needs of the people. And remember, Israel was stopping the aid to come in. So now much more aid is coming in. Then there is a creation of this kind of United States-led civilian structure to supervise what's going on in Gaza. So that's been created. And then there's the disarming of Hamas, which hasn't happened. And then there is the agreement that nobody will be forced to leave Gaza. So Israel, there are forces in Israel who are trying to push the Palestinians out of Gaza. So those forces have been curtailed. Then there is as I said, the reconstruction. Then another point is the reform of the Palestinian Authority. So the Palestinian Authority is the recognized spokesman for the people of Palestine. Right now, it's led by Mr. Abbas, who was elected for 4 years in 2006, and he's still in power somehow. Extremely corrupt government, and so that government is supposed to be reformed. And then it mentions, along with the reform of the government, that the aspirations of the Palestinian people and the possibility of a Palestinian state would happen once all the other steps have been looked after. So this is kind of a medium to long-term plan. So this last stage, which was in the agreement that Netanyahu agreed to, is something that is opposed not only by Netanyahu, but by a majority of people in Israel. And so Mr. Netanyahu, interestingly enough, welcomed the vote in the Security Council, but he welcomed it how? Anybody know? In English. He never spoke in Hebrew about it. Now, you remember there was once an accusation that Palestinian and Arab politicians, they say one thing in Arabic and one thing in English. Remember that was a common complaint way back when? Well, guess what? Mr. Netanyahu has picked up on that very same method, and he never spoke in Hebrew to recommend that this was a good idea. So Hamas rejected the idea because they said, we will not disarm until a Palestinian state is created. And the Israeli government, which is consisting of Mr. Netanyahu and his right-wing partners, they say we will never accept a Palestinian state. So in other words, the two combatants both don't agree with the formula of the UN peace plan. And you know what? That's a good thing. That's not a bad thing. That's a good thing. Because if two sides don't agree to it, that means that there's something good in it that both sides will find hard to agree to. So the whole idea is then you have to kind of push them, from the sides, squeeze them until, they both want somehow or other say that it's in the best interest to go along with this. Now, one thing that's significant about this UN plan is it's very vague. It's vague in the sense that there's no timelines. There's no timeline that says, for example, Hamas must be disarmed by the end of 2025, or that the Palestinian Authority must be reformed by 2026, or that the peacekeeping forces must be in Gaza, by a certain date with a certain number of peacekeepers, or that's your broker. That's your broker calling, or that the donors to rebuild Palestine must commit X trillion dollars by a certain date. Who is not a donor to the rebuilding of Palestine? The US, of course, because Trump never puts money of his own or his country to help Ukraine or to help Gaza or to help Sudan or to help anybody. The money goes to help him and his family. That, of course, and Russia, yes, and Russia. But it is all in all, it's the most remarkable thing that has happened to Gaza and to this conflict since a long time ago. So I think, even though certainly I'm no fan of Mr. President Trump's, but this is really a remarkable achievement, not only to come up with it, but to get the United Nations as a whole to agree to it, and agree to it exactly on the same terms as he put forth, not to change this and change that and change something else. So that is really, I would say, the most important event of this week was this vote in the UN. Now let's look at some other things. Well, let's look at the budget that was agreed to in Parliament this week also. So by a vote of 2 votes out of 400, the Parliament agreed to pass the Liberals' budget. So why is this important? It's important because the Liberals did not have a majority going into as a result of the last elections. So if all the opposition parties wanted, they could have defeated the government on a budget vote, which automatically means the government falls and there has to be new elections. Now, what's unusual about this budget is that it provides for the biggest deficit that ever has been proposed for Canada. In other words, the government is spending by far and away more money than it's going to collect. And therefore, the balance of that money goes, of course, is borrowed. So it goes to our national debt. So why, in general, if you look at the current Prime Minister, Carney, and the previous Prime Minister, Trudeau, Carney is definitely much more in the mainstream or conservative economic mainstream than Trudeau was. After all, Carney was an economist. After all, Carney was the head of the Bank of England. I mean, you can't get a more responsible financial job than that. So why did he propose a budget that is so extraordinarily beyond whatever has been proposed before? Why is he spending so much money that we don't have? So the answer is because of the root of it is all in President Trump. President Trump's tariffs have caused so far so much damage to the Canadian economy that the government said, unless we help the people who are affected, our economy is going to go down even more than it's already gone down. And not only that, but the damage to the economy is very localized. In other words, it's places often not in the cities, but out in the rural areas that are affected. And when a town that has a sawmill that closes down is affected, that's the only employer in town. If the 500 workers lose their jobs, there's nothing else. So that's why it's really so important to help these people through no fault of their own, but through the fault of the US that has shut the business down. And there have already been many sawmill closures in BC, some in Quebec. Quebec has been affected by the tariff on aluminum, where, the aluminum in the Saguenay is an enormous employer there. And putting the tariffs on aluminum has really caused a slowdown in production of aluminum. So aluminum, lumber, car parts, 2 car factories have closed in Canada because of the tariffs in Brampton, Ontario, and in Windsor, Ontario. And so the government says, look, we have to help these people out in one way or another. And the government is also saying that in order to, let's say, stimulate the Canadian economy, it's picked 5 huge mega projects to back. Mega projects that without the government's backing would never happen. One of these projects is here in Quebec. It's to expand the Port of Montreal in Contrecoeur, which is just up downriver from Montreal. They want to expand the port by, making more cranes and more space for cargo to be unloaded and loaded. So that's one of the big mega projects. Another one is a big mine in Ontario, the Ring of Fire. You might have seen some ads for it. Another one is to start more pipelines to bring Alberta oil to the Pacific coast. Most of the oil that's produced in Canada, pretty well all of it that's exported, has gone to the US. And the US has put a tariff on our oil. So what they say is, look, there's plenty of customers in Asia for our oil and our gas. The only problem is there's no way for that oil to get there. And they have just started, they finished a liquefied natural gas project in BC, a medium-sized one, but it's just such a small percentage of what could be exported. So the government is supporting the creation of more pipelines, gas and oil pipelines, to go to the BC coast so our oil and gas can end up in Korea, Japan, Taiwan, Malaysia, Singapore, and other customers like that who have zero sources of their own for these fuels. And that's that. We missed our chance way back when Malaysia was going to build a liquefied natural gas port on the upper BC coast, and all the environmentalists started screaming and yelling, this is going to pollute, this is going to damage, we don't want it, and it got canceled. And they just picked up their money and said, all right, fair enough, we'll get our things somewhere else. So there has to be a balance between environmentalism on the one hand, Indigenous rights on the other hand, and economic development on the other hand. There can't be a veto by one side against the other side. And so what Carney said is there won't be a veto anymore. There'll be consultation, but there's no veto. So these are the big national projects that are supposed to compensate in a way for what the Americans have done to us. A third one is in Churchill, Manitoba, to fix up the port and fix up the railway going to the port, because Hudson's Bay, with this global warming, can end up being an important port in Canada that could end up operating for a lot longer in the calendar year than it is, because Hudson's Bay will be ice-free more than it used to be. So that's the vote in the House of Commons. Now, I said that they wanted by 2 votes, but this is fake. The 2 votes that they won by was prearranged. In other words, people were told not to show up to vote in the opposition to make sure that the budget passed. So this was a kind of a wink, wink, nod, nod situation. Now, okay, leave that alone. Another big, there are a couple of other important things of this week that are, I think, worthwhile to mention. One is to go back to the Russia-Ukraine war, which has been going on now for 3 years. So 3 years ago, Putin decided to conquer the Ukraine, to capture Kiev, the capital, to import a puppet government that will be loyal to him, and then to leave. Except that, of course, we all know 3 years later, this never happened. We forget one thing. We forget that the Ukrainians kicked the Russians out of several fronts. They kicked them out of the northern front going into the Ukraine, and they kicked him out of the southern front on the Dnieper River. So it hasn't only been, it's been a one-sided attack. I mean, the Ukrainians never attacked the Russians, except they did do a small counterattack where they did capture pieces of Russian territory, and then they were forced out of them. At one time he did, but he changed his mind, because he changes his mind, you know, depending on what he eats for breakfast, he changes his mind. But lately the Russians have been making advances simply by wearing down the Ukrainians. Now, the advances are not enormous. Remember, this front is hundreds of miles long, but they are making slow advances. Now, something that I saw, maybe you saw it on TV also, was you know that the Russians are importing foreign soldiers to fight for them. Now, they got the Koreans, we know that, right? But they also got Africans. How do we know this? Because Ukraine captured, I saw on TV, there must have been 20 Black African soldiers that were captured by the Ukrainians on the front. These soldiers were recruited by Russian agents, promised all kinds of money if they would fight for Russia. And these people, of course, are unemployed, poor, and would, you know, anybody waving $2,000 in front of you, you know, plus expenses, you know, they jumped for it. But they're not well trained. They don't know where they're fighting. They don't know anything. And of course, Russia is using them as cannon fodder, pushing them on the front line and just say, okay, go over there. And they end up getting shot and killed and captured. So, you know, Russia is, in a certain sense, reluctant to expand the conscription, which Russia had a conscription age of 27. But, you know, they don't want to expand it. They don't want to make it even more because they're afraid that the people in Russia might turn against them. You know, the people in Russia are already kind of feeling the results of this war. They can't possibly not feel it in terms of inflation, especially in terms of inflation, because inflation has been really very strong in Russia since the war started. There have been, you know, Russia never says how many casualties they've had, but they've had over 1 million casualties in this war. And the population of Russia is around 120 million. So 1% is a pretty high number. So people in Russia know that there have been casualties. One of the smart things that Putin has done is he's made sure that the soldiers who get sent to the war, and especially to the front, don't come from the rich cities, Moscow and St. Petersburg. They come from the countryside. That way, the intelligentsia, the opinion makers, don't have firsthand knowledge of people who've been killed in the war. I mean, they have some, but not as much as the percentages would indicate. So he's done that. What he's also done is he's completely repressed the country so that anybody who has anything to say against the war is regarded as a traitor and could be arrested and sent to jail for a long time. Now, what I read about today is normally you would think that the people who are against the way the war is carried out are people who would be peace activists. In other words, people will call them progressives, will call them moderates, call them what you would like, anti-war people. And plenty of those people were sent to jail. And plenty more of those people left the country. But now what's happening is that there is criticism of the war on the right and saying that the army is not effective enough. They're not doing enough. They're not winning enough. They're not succeeding enough. And the reason for that is because the army is corrupt. The army is not motivated, etc. So these are right-wing patriots, we'll call them, who are pushing Putin to do even more. So before, these voices were tolerated, if not encouraged, to show, look how much support the country has for the war. But now it's getting under Putin's skin. And he's ordered these people to stop talking like this, or they would be thrown in jail also. So the amount of repression in the country is really, really big. And that's, of course, a result of this war. The squeezing of the Russian economy by the sanctions is also playing a role. And the sanctions are getting tighter and tighter on Russia. So that's another thing that's happening. Of course, if we look on the other side, what's happened in Europe as a result of this war is tremendous changes have happened. And these changes are because the Europeans have drawn the conclusion that if Russia manages to take over the Ukraine, who's next? And it's not an idle threat, because Russia has sent ships into Stockholm Harbor. Russia has destroyed the cables carrying internet in the Baltic Sea from the Scandinavian countries to Southern Europe. Russia has already sent drones and even missiles into Poland and Romania and other places, which they say were a mistake, and we didn't mean to do it, but they did it anyway. They've sent drones all over the place looking for everything. So they've spooked Eastern Europe into thinking, hey, this is not just Ukrainians' business, it's all of Europe's business. They've forced all the European countries to start really spending money on their own defense and spending money to help the Ukraine. They've got Finland and Sweden, who were two very neutral countries, to join NATO. I mean, that was just a shock of shocks, because if you think of it, NATO was established at the end of the Second World War to protect and defend Western Europe against the Soviet Union. And now, lo and behold, how many years after 1945, two countries who resisted joining NATO because they say we want to be neutral between the Soviet Union and Western Europe, because after all, we're on the border with Russia, that the invasion of the Ukraine caused these two countries to join up with NATO. And it's also caused other places, like Moldova, to want the same thing. So the action on one side leads to a reaction on the other side. What's surprising, not surprising given the givens of who we're talking about, is you would think that the United States, the strongest and richest country in the world, would be anxious to help the Ukrainians fight off the Russians, who are supposed to be the enemies of the US. And the Ukrainians asked for Tomahawk missiles, which are missiles that are long-range missiles that could strike at key points in Russia, and the US says no. The US gives nothing. So any of the weapons that the US has agreed to send to the Ukrainians, they've sold to the Ukrainians, not given, sold to the Ukrainians, who have no money. So the money is being paid by Western Europe to the US to buy weapons for the Ukraine. That's what's been going on up till now. The Ukrainians did this week, they had two successful hits on Russian oil exporting facilities and on an oil refinery. But the Russians are just shooting hundreds and hundreds of missiles at civilian targets in the Ukraine. And although so many of the missiles get shot down, there's always some that get through. Just like in Israel, I mean, the Iranians did the same thing. They got some missiles that landed in Israel. And in Yemen, the Houthis also got missiles that landed in Israel. I mean, just because if you send 1,000 missiles, a few of them are going to manage to cause damage. So that's what's been going on on that front. Another yesterday I read about, or no, this morning, there was an election in Chile. Remember, I did a class on elections and how November is election time. Well, Chile is the wealthiest country in South America. And they had a kind of a jungle primary type election. And this is a kind of a system that's getting to be popular. And what that means is that people will say, anybody who wants to run for president, go ahead. You know, put your name on the ballot. And the top, if nobody gets over 50%, then the top two people end up in a second round against each other. So France has that system. Places now in the US are using that system. In California, they're using that system also. It's a kind of we'll call it a shortcut to democracy. And it's something that assures that whoever wins an election gets more than half of the votes. So in a certain sense, it's a stamp of majority rule on whoever gets to run the country. Because like in the system that we have, you could have ridings where you can have three parties and one gets 33%, and one gets 32%, and one gets 31%, and the one who gets the 33% wins that riding, even though it only has a third of the support. So by having second rounds like they do in France, they say, okay, the top two, those are the top two that are going to run in the second round. And that way, by definition, somebody is going to get more than half of the vote. Of course, other people can say, well, we're just not voting, you know, because we don't like either of these two. But still, you know, the people who don't vote don't count. So it assures a kind of a majority choice of people. Well, in a two-party system, that's not so important, because in a two-party system, always one of the parties, like in the US, is gonna get the majority of the vote. But many countries don't have a two-party system, including Canada, including Israel, including almost all of Western Europe, Germany, Holland, Spain, Italy. I mean, you know, there's more than just two opinions to be represented. And that's the way it is in most places. So either you end up with a system of coalitions like they have in Holland or Belgium or Israel, or you end up with a kind of a second round like they have in France, where you know, for president anyway, and also for the seats in the assembly, where somebody is going to win over half of the vote. So in Chile, what happened was that you had this ultra right-wing guy came up with 24% of the vote, and this communist representing a bunch of left-wing parties ended up with 27% of the vote. So these two are going to go against each other in the second round. But if you look at the total of the right-wing parties, they got 70%. And the total of the left-wing parties, they got 30%. So it's likely that the right-wing guy is going to win the election in Chile this time around. This right-wing guy is an ultra-Catholic, ultra-conservative, against, you know, abortion, against gays, the usual list of things that right-wing politicians stand for. And he is like really an ultra-conservative. His name is Kast. K-A-S-T, probably from a German origin, from the German people that came to live in Chile. But the ex-prime minister, he was a socialist, not a communist, which again for Chile was really quite unique, because Chile, after Pinochet was deposed from office, always had a center-right and a center-left opposition. And that system ran for over 1994 till now, so we're talking 30-odd years. And now all of a sudden, you know, that system is broken down, and you have an ultra left against an ultra right guy for the president of the country. One thing I would have to say in terms of Israel is that the former president, Mr. Boric, he was really anti-Israel, pro-Palestine as you can get. So if this new guy gets elected, that will change pretty quickly. So that's the Chilean election of yesterday. Let's see if I've got something else here. A whole bunch of things here. Well, like I said, if you didn't hear, they did a recount in Cote-Saint-Luc, and Mayor Torchman won by 7 votes instead of winning by 1 vote. So he's definitely the mayor. I'm sorry? The ballot. Oh, that I don't know. I voted. I voted. I live in Cote-Saint-Luc, but I live in Cote-Saint-Luc. It wasn't defective. You had a choice of one or the other, Torchman or Brownstein. Oh yeah, you didn't. Yeah, they could have had a big square that's white, and you just make an X on the square. Yeah, I don't know who designs these things, but it doesn't mean it's defective. It just means that it's right. Oh, they had that design. Yeah, it was the yeah, there were about 200 rejected ballots, but no, but you don't know why they were rejected. Somebody could have put in an empty ballot with no vote. How come what? Oh, the most rejected ballots. I don't know the reason. It could be the design, it could be something else. Well, to me, I mean, listen, all you had to do is take a pen. Yeah, right. Well, you know what? It used to be, I can tell you this, it used to be a lot of rejected ballots in previous election, not in Côte Saint Luc, but everywhere. Remember that you used to have a square. You had to put an X or a tick in the square, right? And what they did was if your line went out of the box, they would say that's a rejected ballot. But nowadays they don't do that anymore because they say, hey, it's ridiculous. If we could see clearly who the person wanted, doesn't matter if the line of the X goes out of the ballot. Okay, I mean, to me it was clear. They gave me a pencil. The dot was pretty small, but ballots are rejected for all kinds of reasons. People write stuff on them. They write slogans or messages. People will tear the ballot and send it in, or people will vote for both of them, or people will vote for neither of them. I mean, there's lots of reasons why ballots get rejected. So, yeah, but well, but look at what's the percentage of rejected ballots?
Sir,
200 ballots out of 8,600. Two, 200 out of 8,600. Well, but it's still 200 over 8,600 is like what? 2.5%? There always are rejected ballots. Always are. But I agree with you. To me, if I was designing something to make it clear, especially for older people, that circle is pretty small that you had to fill in. It was small. It really was. But I mean, you have to have some common sense. But in any case, look, as I said before, As I said before, over the years, the city has changed, like every city changes. The people living in the city have changed, like everybody, like everywhere, right? So the people who are in this room are senior citizens and English speaking. The city of Cote-Saint-Luc now has a majority of people who are not senior citizens and English speaking, and not and secular or liberal Jews. So the city has changed in that lots of young couples are living here, lots of families are living here, lots of francophones are living here, and lots of religious Jewish people are living here. And all of those people are people who voted for Torgman because that's who he is, and it's just the way demographics determine some. There's a saying, demographics determine history, and that here's a good example of it in Côte Saint-Luc. So, there is a new mayor. I mean, yes, Mitch Brownstein was mayor for a very long time, and nothing lasts forever. There's nothing he didn't. At least he wasn't somebody who committed graft, which is the worst thing that someone can do, really. Corruption, giving contracts to companies that he owns. Think of Donald Trump. He set up from nothing, he set up a crypto business. And out of nowhere, this rich Chinese businessman put $2 billion into a startup crypto company owned by Donald Trump's family. So tell me something, like, isn't that not corruption? I mean, that's an example, a clear example of the unspeakable things that this president has done, and there's so many of them. But clear corruption where there isn't even a layer of 25 layers separating the money from the president. Now there's half a layer. So you know, that's him. And then, of course, there's the jet that was given to him by the Qataris. And then there's the investment of the Saudi Arabians in all kinds of stuff that he owns. I mean, and loans that we don't even know that he was given, that he'll never have to pay back. I mean, if anybody ever had a chance to really investigate it, they'd be busy for years looking at the out and out corruption in that in that administration. Not to speak about the judicial attacks ordering the Minister of Justice to take out cases against his enemies, which you're not allowed to do. You're not supposed to do that. Let's say the Justice Department is supposed to be neutral. Anyway, that's just a complete separate story. Let me just have a quick look here, see what else. Oops. And then we'll do some questions, comments. Oh yes, that's right. I forgot about this part. That the United States announced yesterday that they're selling F-35 jets to Saudi Arabia. Selling, and the word selling is important. So these jets are the most advanced jets in the world. Israel has them. So if Israel has all the technology that goes into the jets, Saudi Arabia will have the exact same technology going into their jets. Now, what Israel had wanted was first that the United States not sell them the jets. Secondly, they said, if you sell them the jets, we want Saudi Arabia to recognize Israel in return. So what happened? The United States sold Saudi Arabia their jets with no demand on Saudi Arabia to do anything as far as Israel is concerned. So that was another event of the week. And for Mr. Trump, it's all about the money, of course. And as he says, and he's correct, that these jets are built by people in every single state of the U.S. They have some sort of input into making these jets. These jets are billions of dollars worth, billions, not millions, billions of dollars worth. And so, you know, this is just another major threshold crossing event in the history of the Middle East, we'll say. It's really, really important because Israel now no longer has air superiority in the Middle East, which they once had, once these jets get delivered to Saudi Arabia. Yeah, sure. Let me just, I just want to check my time. Okay, we're good. Yeah. So now we'll do some questions, comments about any of the different things I spoke about or anything else that's on your mind. Yeah. Right. Except, yeah. Except Russia. Well, and certainly, yeah. Mm, it's an interesting concept that maybe they voted for the plan in turn of getting relief in the tariffs, but I don't think so. I don't think that's, I've never seen that come up anywhere. But what is significant is Trump said, as you all know, the tariffs will not be a burden to American citizens, that the people who are exporting goods to the US will pay the tariffs. But in fact, of course, it's the people who import the goods to the US who pay the tariffs. So what Trump said was, well, the companies exporting the goods will lower their price by the equal amount of the tariffs so that the American consumer will not have to pay more. And that's what he said. This week, as you know, he announced a reduction or elimination of tariffs on 200 items. The most important items were coffee, cocoa, tomatoes, bananas, spices, and all kinds of tropical fruits that are not grown in the US, mangoes, avocados, and stuff like that. So, how come if the tariffs didn't cause the prices to go up, now he's saying by eliminating the tariffs, the prices will go down? So, isn't that a contradiction? Of course, it's a contradiction. And the reason why he did it was the results of the elections that I spoke about last week in Virginia and in New Jersey were just so overwhelmingly pro-democratic. And people were complaining that costs have gone up, especially coffee, which has gone up by somewhere over 20 to 25% in price in 1 year. So he's, you know, he listens, Trump, and he says, okay, by eliminating the tariffs, now the prices will come down. But of course, somebody could say, well, if tariffs are such a great idea and it's raising the government's, you know, money so much, by lowering the tariffs, you're just going to stop money coming into the government. What about that argument? So you see, he's caught in a way, he's caught both ways. But he's definitely aware that the American people are aware that their inflation is going up. And oh, the other important item I didn't mention that he cut the tariffs on is beef. Beef, meaning not, unfortunately, not live animals, which Canada sells to the US, but cut up, you know what I mean? Cut up processed beef, cut up beef, because the beef prices in the US have gone, and here too, have gone up tremendously. And Americans love beef. And, you know, he figures that will lower the prices, which theoretically it will. Theoretically, all these prices should come down, but it's not, doesn't happen overnight, number one. And there's other factors that affect the price besides the tariffs. So that was the other, that's the other, you know, that was the other announcement of the week. So he's admitted the tariffs cause prices to go up. So once he admits that, why doesn't he say, okay, well, I'll get rid of all the tariffs because then the prices will go down? But, you know, he's caught in this lie of his own making. We'll put it like that. Somebody else, wait, just a second. Somebody else had their hand up over there someplace. I saw, yeah, go ahead. You have to speak louder. Oh, the ballots, okay. The ballots were the same format. Yeah, I don't know. I didn't vote I wasn't living in Cote-Saint-Luc for the previous election. Yeah. I mean, it is a little bit of common sense. Obviously, if 8,400 people voted so that the ballots, the votes could count, and 200 people, had their votes rejected, who knows what the reasons were that they were rejected. So, I mean, you have to, rely on common sense of people. They understand that you have a name and a circle, and the one that you want to pick, you have to do something to the circle. Now, for example, what I don't know is, let's say somebody drew an X on the circle, would that count or not count? That I don't know. Yeah. I think the idea is the person who counts the vote can look at it and say, okay, this is the person he wanted, where the X is, I colored it in with the pencil. I made like a nice little circle with the pencil. Sure. Yeah. Like I said, there's every election has rejected ballots. And these rejected people are rejected ballots for a million different reasons. And I mentioned the most common of them. Somebody will put the ballot in without putting any mark on it. Somebody will vote for both of them. Somebody will write somebody else's name on it. Somebody will, put some sort of slogans on the ballot. Somebody will tear the ballot. I mean, there's lots of reasons why ballots get rejected. But it's a small percentage. If it was half the ballots, then I would start to worry. But 2% is really not a, not a big number. Yeah, yeah, yeah. The environmentalists are still adamant. Now, so we're talking now about the oil and gas pipelines that are going from Alberta to BC. There's also talk of building a gas pipeline from Alberta to Quebec, and making the port in Saguenay, in Chicoutimi, where, the Saguenay River is for ocean going ships. They could have a liquid gasification plant there and pick up the gas and go to Europe, because that would replace the gas that Russia is selling to Europe. But that is a long-term plan. And originally, I remember the Quebec government said, absolutely not, we don't want it. Now, Premier Legault is saying, you know what, it's not a half bad idea. And why not? If people are willing to put their money where their mouth is, and say, I'm willing to invest billions of dollars today for a return tomorrow, like, why should the government stop that? So the reason why they wanted to stop that before, there's two reasons or three reasons. One reason is, if you believe that Canada and the world is transitioning away from oil and gas toward renewables, then what you're doing is building a white elephant. You're building something that won't have any use in 25 years. If everyone has an electric car, and if everyone is generating electricity from wind and solar, what's the point of having a gas and oil pipeline? Who's gonna buy that for all of the money that it costs to build it? That's reason number one. Reason number two is the danger of having a leak in the pipeline, either on the land leak or once it gets to the port, that the port would leak the oil and not gas, but the oil, into pristine waters of northern British Columbia. So, whenever you have a pipeline, there's going to be a leak. There always are. That's just physics. But, the point is that you fix these leaks and then they're not leaks anymore. But the danger is they say, well, if it leaks, it will destroy X, Y, and Z habitat and waterways and all kinds of things like that. The third reason for objections is the idea of indigenous say in these matters. And since these pipelines go through territories which the indigenous people are claiming, they say that we have the right to veto the existence of the pipeline. So those are the three reasons why the previous government sort of put a very, negative finger on the development of the pipelines. The Conservative Party, when they ran for office, of course, said, no, we are in favor of all of this. And, when the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, there was kind of a bit of a reason to say, look, the world wants oil and gas that don't come from Russia, so let's give a chance for our own people to develop these resources, number one. Number two, the abandonment of oil and gas is not happening as fast as people would have thought. And, as you know, in the United States, President Trump has pretty well said, burn, baby, burn, and drill, baby, drill. And coal is the new miracle drug. And forget about all this wind and solar stuff. So the oil and gas industry is not dying out as fast as people would have thought. Part of the reason being that the world is getting richer. The developing world is getting richer. So places like Vietnam or Thailand or India, especially countries that were like not the poorest in the world, but one or two levels up, that people there are getting richer faster than the Western world is developing. And when you get richer, one of the things you want to have is a motorbike or a car. And not all of these motorbikes and cars will run on electricity because they're more expensive to buy if they're electric. And you need the power generation to supply the electricity that these countries don't have. So they buy diesel motorbikes or diesel cars, and therefore they need the fuel to come from somewhere. India has really no resources of oil whatsoever. I don't saying whatsoever, I'm saying they have very, very little. So they have to import more than ever before. They were importing it from Russia. China was importing it from Russia. And if the pressure gets hard enough not to do that, then they will have to look elsewhere. And Canada is one of the elsewheres. So that's that's the reason why things have changed in the direction of development. Also there is a reaction in general, we'll just say in general, a reaction to, we'll call it ultra woke ideas. So this term of NIMBY, not in my backyard. We want housing, but not here. We want oil, but not there. And governments are starting to react to that idea to say, well, wait a minute, you have a say, but you don't have a veto. And that's the difference. So that's why some of these projects are getting promoted. Somebody else have something to ask or say? Yes, sir, go ahead. I'll repeat the question because I know you can't hear. I don't understand what your question is. Oh, the Saudis, yeah. 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 The Saudis, remember, have always been the biggest oil producer in the world, biggest oil exporter in the world. We won't say producer, we'll say exporter. The US is now the biggest oil producer in the world. But as far as exporting, the Saudis are the biggest exporters. And for a long time, all the Saudis had going for them was oil. But the Saudis have accumulated so much money. The Saudi oil company called Aramco, they just agreed to sell to the public somewhere between 5 and 10% of their total shares. They raised zillions of dollars in that sale. It's the most profitable company in the world. Why is Aramco one of the most profitable company in the world? Because oil today sells for $60 a barrel. It used to sell for 80. At the top, it was selling for 120. The cost of production of Aramco oil is between $3 and $10 a barrel. And they're selling it for $60 to $100 a barrel. There's a lot of barrels. There's a lot of barrels that get sold. That's where all that money is. So Saudi Arabia is trying to broaden out their economy by investing in all kinds of other things, AI, tourism, all kinds of stuff like that. And Saudi Arabia has always consistently said that they're willing to have relations with Israel on condition that Israel agrees to a Palestinian state. That's been the formula that the president, remember MBS, he's not the king of Saudi Arabia. His dad, his father, who's old and ill, is still the king. His father always said that all Arabs have the duty to stand with the Palestinian people. And his father never changed that. And he made MBS himself promise to go along with that formula in exchange for MBS becoming the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. So MBS, he's the one who's visiting Washington. He stands by that. He's never changed it. He said, look, we're willing to recognize Israel if Israel is willing to recognize Palestine. And you know what he did to help Israel? He allowed overflights of Saudi Arabia by Israeli planes. That's a big deal. So if you're flying a plane, if El Al is flying from Israel to India, they don't have to go all the way around the bottom of Saudi Arabia to end up coming back to go to India. They can just fly straight over Saudi Arabia and end up in the Indian Ocean and go straight to India that way. And they also have a lot of, we'll call it informal economic ties to Israel that they never had before. But as far as out and out recognition, Israel has to do its part as far as Saudi Arabia is concerned. And this government in Israel, for the many, many faults that it has, then the non-acceptance or recognition, not just of Palestinian state, but of the Palestinian people themselves, is the fault that's holding Israel back in the eyes of many people around the world. Because as you know, and maybe we'll finish with this, there have been hundreds of attacks by Israeli terrorists, Jewish terrorists, on Palestinian villages and towns in the West Bank. And they're getting filmed, they're getting broadcast all over the world. These are masked people walking around with weapons and sticks and setting fire to anything they want to set fire to. And, the people who are the victims of this are just really innocent civilians. And the army has not stepped in, the police have not stepped in, because the Ministry of Public Security is in the hands of these very people, Mr. Ben-Gvir, who said that there is no such thing as a Jewish terrorist, there's only Arab terrorists. He said that any Jew who gets arrested for attacking an Arab has to be released from prison within 2 days. And he's in charge of the prison. So that's where things are now. And finally, the prime minister has finally said, oh, you know what? This is Not that he cares about the victims, but he cares about the image that is being portrayed of Israel all around the world. So he says something has to happen to stop this. He doesn't say the people have to be arrested and charged. The figures that I read were 94% of the people who do this are never arrested. Of the 6% who are arrested, 1% are charged. Of the 1% are charged, almost zero end up in jail. So if you can just do whatever you want to people you don't like, it's just carte blanche. So that's that. I'm sorry? You want to comment on my comment? Sure. Yes, sure they report attacks of Jews, attacks on Jews by Arabs. Yeah, but by attacks on Arabs. Sure, this is getting reported by every media that you could see. It's everywhere. It's everywhere. The settlers are attacking Arabs. It's getting reported. Now, if you say how come the other way isn't done, that's called whataboutism. Whataboutism is a way of arguing to deflect from what you're actually talking about to say, well, maybe this is bad, but how about the other side? But that's not a germane argument, because what you're saying is, don't look at what we're doing, only look at what somebody else is doing. But the idea is that the world is looking at what Israel is doing. It doesn't take away from the other way also. The other way is also reported on and is newsworthy. But remember that Israel holds itself to a higher standard than Hamas holds itself to, let's say. So, that's the point. Israel is supposed to be a democratic Western country with a fair judicial system. And if the judicial system doesn't imprison people who are causing terrorism, then it's not a democratic country anymore. That's the point. Anyway, listen, I want to thank everybody for coming, and I will see you again in the springtime, I hope. So be safe, don't fall, don't slip, and please come back in the spring.